I want to start today with the team that's number one in the polls. They've been number one in the polls for well over a year now. They're also number one in the 24/7 Sports College Ball Recruiting team rankings, and that's Georgia. Steve, I'll throw this to you first. Is this number one with a bullet? Does anybody have a chance to catch them?
I think it's sewn up. I would think that Georgia will take this all the way to the finish line and finish with 24/7 Sports number one recruiting class. I think this might be like Kirby Smart's fourth number one class. I'm losing track, but there was a time where Nick Saban had like 9 in a row, and Coach Smart went from like 3 to 2 to 1 and finally unseated that. And you're starting to see what happens when you get the number one class in the country. You start winning the national championship, and they've recruited well, they've developed well, and that track record is allowing them to continue to recruit at a high level, but they take nothing for granted. I mean, it starts with Coach Smart. He's very dedicated to the recruiting efforts of the program, and that's not just getting on the phones and talking to top targets. It's making sure that their evaluation process is buttoned up, challenging the coaches to take the best players that they can take, being involved in that film study, and them collectively deciding who has the traits to play at Georgia, not just physically, but mentally. So a lot goes into their process of why they not only land great players, but then they're able to develop them because they're just so thorough with their process.
Guys, who would you say Georgia fought the toughest battles with this year as far as like opposing schools? They have a lot of 4 and 5 stars in their class. Is there a school that in your mind you can recall that like they came up against a lot?
I think it's the standard status quo guys, right? Dylan Raiola, their quarterback commit, one time committed to Ohio State. Ellis Robinson, Jaden Riddell, they had Alabama on their short list. Jaden Riddell is also looking heavy at Tennessee. They've been running into Oregon a little bit more with their protege Dan Lanning out west. There was a time where I thought Justin Williams, maybe the top linebacker in the country, was an Oregon lean. But he's headed to Georgia. Those are the top players in the class. They probably went toe-to-toe with Tennessee quite a bit as Tennessee tries to elevate their program, right? They were on the cusp of making that next step. Right now they're in that New Year's Six territory, knocking on the door of college football playoff. But with the way they're recruiting with the top 10 class last year, another potential top 10 class this year, they're trying to bust through the door. And with that, they're running into head-to-heads with Georgia. And they're winning some too, so it's exciting if you're a Tennessee Vols fan with their trajectory and the way that they're recruiting on the trail.
Coop,
I think there's.
Go ahead.
I think there's been a little bit more parity, right? I mean, we're in the NIL era, and you have some fan bases of schools that haven't reached that glory in a while, and I think that creates a situation where Georgia might not get the guy that it would seem like they should get, right? So not only is Georgia trying to balance their 85-man roster in terms of talent, but you got a whole nother element kind of essentially with a salary cap. I mean, I think with Georgia, you look at the past 2 years, anyone that supports that program, I mean, they've donated X amount of dollars. Now you have schools out there that are going to do whatever it takes to play for a national title. So I think that's an added element in all this. And Georgia's still getting the best of the best. But, you look at their recruiting class, and it's a really, really good recruiting class. I mean, they have 2 top 247 quarterbacks committed. They have one of the heaviest and biggest offensive lines ever assembled. They call it the Great Wall of Athens. They got 3 running backs that are on my freaks list. But look at a position like safety, right? It's like, how are they going to finish there? KJ Bolden's a guy that they've been on from the jump, committed to Florida State. Auburn's been another school that they've gone head to head with. So I think it's a little bit different in that sense. There's some battles that have the tides have changed. It wouldn't have been like this maybe 5 years ago, in my opinion.
Yeah, I will say, I think Georgia would have a higher rated recruiting class pre-NIL than they do now. Which might be crazy to some people out there listening to this right now, but it's I mean, I think about like the Nye Carr situation, how that happens. Nye Carr going down to Miami, right? And that's kind of what Georgia's in the middle of right now. Ellis Robinson also in the middle of Miami. They got to go to Texas to go get a guy like Joseph Jonah Ajayi. They've invested heavily in the offensive line. I mean, these are big wins. Andrew and I have talked about it, but when it comes to, if you want to call it balancing the books, if you want to make it that black and white, it's like, what do you want to invest in? You want to invest in your quarterback? They got the number one quarterback in the country. You want to invest in your corner spot? They got the number one corner in the country. You want to invest in your offensive line? They arguably had the best unit there in terms of putting that unit together, and they had pass rushers all over the board. So I think they're going to be smart. I think you're going to see teams going forward. You're not just going to be able to throw the whole lot 1 through 25 and say, hey, we're going to take the best players in the country. You're going to have to be pretty selective with your spending. I think Drew brings up a great point with the salary cap. It's going to be more of a mix and match, and then how do you fill in the blanks from there?
Well, if you're talking about Georgia or schools like Ohio State, schools of that magnitude, the one wall that they maybe run into in the NIL field is like, we love this player, but the price that he's getting from a couple other programs, if we paid him that, he would be this number player paid on our current roster. And we cannot have that. We're competing for the national championship. That guy's going to be an early round draft pick. Like, he can make that money here, but he cannot make that money here on day one. Like it's so maybe that's going to level the playing field in college football. It's going to be an interesting dynamic, but to your point, Cooper, this Williams Nwaneri is a guy that, does he end up at Georgia if NIL is not in play, and that's no disrespect to, Mizzou, who obviously is 5-1 and having a great year and a lot of excitement around their program, but certainly NIL was an element in his decision. And Georgia can only go to a certain level sometimes unless they're okay with saying to their locker room, hey man, there might be a true freshman making more than you.
Which obviously, I mean, you got to balance the locker room chemistry. I guess it's safe to say that given the class sizes are a little bit smaller than they used to be, because most teams, even Georgia this year, we saw they took 3 or 4 kids in the transfer portal, including a couple at receiver. You just don't have quite as many spots to give out as you used to. Like, gone are the days where a school, for the most part, is taking that 30 or 32 or 35 high school players. This is the number one class, but it's just because of the changes in the sport, not necessarily any fault of Georgia. Like, it's not like the number one class of all time, obviously, were achieved maybe 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Well, I don't want to push completely back on that, but I think the NCAA, and everyone wants to talk about the photo shoots, but them coming out and essentially eliminating the counters, to me, that gets my mind churning a little bit, because I think now you can get a little more creative with what you want to take on the back end of your class. And some schools are going to have way more of a luxury than others, but for Georgia, they can take some calculated shots, and hey, if it doesn't work out, I mean, you can essentially push that guy right outside the building, and you just got to get down to 85 guys. So yeah, the transfer portal, absolutely. That is going to be Georgia bringing in those 2 wide receivers. They hadn't really brought in any transfers prior to that this past winter. And I think everyone's still kind of figuring out how to balance it. But my big theory, or not theory, is transfer portal, free agency, right? NFL draft, that's your high school recruiting. And if you look at the teams in the college football playoff conversation, there's been a balance of both of that, right? And a lot of them are developing in-house. I don't think the high school recruiting is really going to go anywhere.